ValdostaToday.com, post on the web. Used under fair use by G.B.R, Ghetto Free Press. Historian Dr. Alfred Willis visited Kola earlier this month to teach about the history of the Liberty Theater and Liberty Club in honor of Black History Month. Special thanks to everyone in attendance that wanted to learn more about the history of the historic downtown area and be part of the conversation. Thank you to Kola Valdosta, Valdosta Heritage Foundation, George Boston Rhines, and the concerned members of the Valdosta community who came out in support. The Valdosta Historic Preservation Ordinance should be repealed. Apparently, the Valdosta City Council can reverse it with one vote. The ordinance allows the demolition of structures like historic Liberty Theater, pushing closer to Black downtown historic African American commercial district, being further decimated and its history eroded. Let's join together and eradicate Black voter apathy, strengthen our interracial city council, and hold accountable the leadership from the mayor all the way to the voters. Hashtag Valdosta. @followers.
Romans 8:7 says, because the carnal mind is enmity against God,
ValdostaToday.com, post on the web. Used under fair use by G.B.R. Ghetto Free Press. Historian Dr. Alfred Willis visited Kola earlier this month to teach about the history of the Liberty Theater and Liberty Club in honor of Black History Month. Special thanks to everyone in attendance that wanted to learn more about the history of the historic downtown area and be part of the conversation. Thank you to Kola Valdosta, Valdosta Heritage Foundation, George Boston Rhines, and the concerned members of the Valdosta community who came out in support. The Valdosta Historic Preservation Ordinance should be repealed. Apparently, the Valdosta City Council can reverse it with one vote. The ordinance allows the demolition of structures like historic Liberty Theater, pushing closer to Black downtown historic African American commercial district, being further decimated and its history eroded. Let's join together and eradicate Black voter apathy, strengthen our interracial city council, and hold accountable the leadership from the mayor all the way to the voters. Hashtag Valdosta. At followers.
Good evening.
Good evening.
I'm tired. We had a soup kitchen earlier, but I'd like to welcome you guys to Kola. Kola is Quality of Life Association. We're a nonprofit organization, and we're a house here. What you guys will probably know is the Liberty Theater. Tonight we are celebrating Black History Month, and we wanted to do a talk, and we are thankful to have Valdosta Heritage Foundation to be here tonight. And also we have an amazing speaker. I wish we had more like Mr. Al, I call him Al Willis. He is very knowledgeable when it comes to anything dealing with historical. We are blessed to have him in the city of Valdosta, and I'm not gonna hold you too long, and I guarantee you are in for a treat. Okay, so welcome.
Thank you. Thank you.
Thank you. And we can go on to the slide you were supposed to be watching while that was happening. This is the title of my talk, Valdosta's Liberty Theater and Liberty Club, and there you see an old aerial view of the neighborhood in which we find ourselves tonight as it once existed with the Liberty Theater circled when it was relatively fresh. All right? Our subject is one that deals very explicitly with race and race relations in the 20th century United States. This building is actually a product of Jim Crow culture. And here I've given you a kind of little, my sort of definition. It was a white supremacist obsession that prevailed in the United States for almost a century when survivals of antebellum custom hardened into legalized caste systems that assured racial discrimination, particularly against African Americans. Next. We are also here in the south side of Valdosta, which originated as a racially diverse part of town, but in the 20th century, particularly beginning with the 20s, with a lot of migration from the rural areas of Lowndes County into town. The south side was the location in which a very large percentage of the African American newcomers settled, and from that time, the racial balance, so to speak, on the south side began to shift decidedly toward an African American majority. As part of this shift, South Ashley Street, the 400 block especially, but also extending into the 600 block of South Ashley Street, developed into what amounted to a quote-unquote separate but equal downtown that consisted mostly of businesses and culture institutions that were either owned by African Americans or catered to African Americans, or both. And there the little red arrow shows like where Ashley Street is situated on that aerial photograph. Next. The Jim Crow system of spatial segregation by race affected all building types, but tonight we're going to be especially concerned with the building type of the motion picture theater. And we're going to deal with this theater because it was part of a chain based in Columbus, Georgia, that was founded by Roy Martin in the 19-teens and later operated in collaboration with his two sons as Martin Theaters. Those of you of a certain age might remember going to the movies in what was still into the 60s Martin Theaters here in Valdosta. These are three of their theaters in their chains, and they illustrate different approaches to racial segregation in the theater world. On the first two examples from the left and the middle, you see two theaters where the entire buildings were reserved for members of a single race. On the left, you had a theater that was reserved for African American patronage. In the middle, you have one of their Columbus theaters that was reserved for only white patronage. Another approach was to divide a single space into subspaces. This one is unusual, the Martin Theater in Opelika, Alabama, because its division was vertical. The balcony was divided by a low wall right down the middle, and African Americans were told to sit on one side, and white patrons were told to sit on the other side of that little wall. And meanwhile, there was also a horizontal division of this theater because on the ground floor, this was reserved only for white patrons. So those are two different approaches. Next. Beginning in 1934, Roy Martin began to substantially expand his involvement in the theater world of Valdosta with his purchase of the leases to the Ritz and the Palace Theaters. The Ritz was downtown on the corner of Patterson and Jackson Street. The Palace, whose building still stands, was just over here on near the corner of South Patterson and MLK. And then in 1938, he actually bought the Palace building, and later he acquired the Ritz Theater, you can see in the late 30s. And in 1940, he began operating this theater, and in 1941, the Valdosta Theater. And that was the beginning of his little mini theater empire here in Valdosta. Next. Here you see the Palace. It was built in 1926. It had a balcony. It maybe or even probably used the balcony as a place for seating for African American customers, but that is not known for certain. Later on, it was certainly used for the seating of African American customers. Next. And here was the Ritz. This was also built in the 1920s. It had space planned for a balcony, but that balcony was never installed in the early years of this theater. No longer exists. Next. Part of the motivation for Martin's ongoing investments in Valdosta in the 1930s may be due to this article that appeared in the Motion Picture Herald in 1936. This was a magazine that was published for the use of people like Mr. Martin who were in the theater business. And in this article, they demonstrated that across the country, there was a very large sort of untapped market, African-American market, for movie-going opportunities. And they were encouraging people like Martin to figure out ways, presumably by building new theaters, to tap into that market. So he was probably very, very aware of this trend. Next. And he was not the only one. There was a group of investors in Valdosta who founded a little company called Southland Theaters, and they actually decided in 1939 to open a theater that would be for African Americans only. It was directly across the street from St. Paul's AME Church in a building that no longer exists. And at the same time, they were opening another small theater that they intended to be used only for white patrons. So that occurred in the earliest months of 1940 when those two opened. The one catering to African Americans, you can see, was known as the Harlem Theater. Next. Okay, at the same time, and probably spurred on by these investments of the Southland Theater Company, Martin spent a lot of money adding a balcony into the Ritz that he intended to offer at discounted prices. And it was possible to believe that he intended to offer discounts to students at the college. However, next, he announced on February 5th, 1940, that this balcony was going to be open to African Americans who wanted to see movies at the Ritz. And immediately, Valdosta's city council, which perhaps to no one's surprise, was rather racist at the time, they passed an ordinance forbidding so-called mixed audiences to be seated in any single theater building. And because the Ritz Theater with its balcony and the Palace were the only two theaters that had that policy, and because the ordinance exempted the Palace Theater, obviously ordinance was only aimed at the Ritz Theater. And Martin then began a series of negotiations with the city council and the mayor to no avail. He claimed the policy was unfair to him as a businessman. He had just invested all this money, and now the city was making it impossible for him to exploit his investment in the way he intended or wished. And so, next, he adopted another strategy. And on 29th of February 1940, he managed to buy two lots. One on the corner of South Ashley and Florida Avenue, and the other one, the adjacent lot on Florida Avenue, which is the lot on which we are right now seated. And at the same time, he negotiated, well, later that year in 1940, he negotiated a lease on a building on North Ashley Street that he went on to remodel as the Valdosta Theater, which also still exists. He wanted to exploit this one for African American patronage and the Valdosta for white patronage, just exactly in the same way as he had done in Columbus and his Southland theaters were doing at that same time in Valdosta. And here you see the Liberty Theater and the Valdosta Theater side by side. You can see that they're both very, very similar because they participate in architectural branding, which was something that Martin was a pioneer in exploiting. This is making all the buildings in a particular chain look very much alike. We're now used to this in building types such as fast foods like McDonald's, Burger King, Wendy's. They all look sort of alike. And so Martin wanted all of his theaters to be recognizable from the outside just by looking at them. And this is the result. Next. Now we'll talk a little bit about what I call the Liberty Complex. Some people call it the Liberty Theater Block. Okay? This was a mixed-use group of entertainment facilities. And we'll talk about what that means in the next, I don't know, 20 or 30 slides. I forget how many there are. Next. Okay? This was actually a single L-shaped building. There on your left, you see an aerial view. You can see the L-shaped, a lighter colored and a darker colored roof. And then the rest you see are kind of grass and pavements, okay? And here you see a view from Florida Avenue, and there you see what was the seam between the main block, what we're in right now, which was to the western, was the western part of the building, and the eastern wing of the building. This part was the only part of the building that had 4 brick bearing walls running all the way around that supported its roof. So this is a freestanding part of the building. The other one only had 3 walls that hooked into this part, and those walls and the party wall, so to speak, the wall right there to your left, that brick wall, was what supported the roof of the east wing, okay? But they were a functionally integrated whole. They were essentially a single commercial building that was exploited as a whole by the Martin interests. Next. Okay. Martin was well aware of the 20th century trend in theater construction and theater exploitation of building theaters that would have spaces other than just theater spaces. This is because if the theater failed to make money, then you lost your entire investment. And a better strategy seemed to be to include in a theater building some other kind of spaces, like business office spaces for rent or retail spaces for rent, making multi-use buildings. And that was exactly what the Royal Theater in Columbus was that Martin built, and exactly what the Ritz Theater was built in the 20s by other interests altogether. Okay, next. And in his Liberty Theater in Columbus, Martin, which was a single-use theater, this was only a theater, and Martin had learned the hard way what happens when you just have a theater with no other spaces that could generate income from other sources. And it wasn't because the theater was unsuccessful. This was actually a very, very successful theater operation that catered to African-American patrons only. And it was located in a part of Columbus that was kind of their version of Valdosta's 400 block of South Ashley. It was kind of a separate downtown. But Martin noticed that all around it, because there were so many customers coming to see the movies, people were making money off their little candy stores and cafes and bars and newsstands and these kind of businesses, and he wasn't getting any of that profit. So when it came time to build his Liberty Theater in Valdosta, he had a different idea. Next. Okay, and this was to build what I call the Liberty Complex, which was going to be this mixed-use facility that was going to have a theater, but it was also going to have a variety of other spaces that could be leased out and could generate income even if the theater was not successful. And it turned out not to be. But I'm getting ahead. And one of the most interesting things that the recent demolition has shown is that the lobby of the Liberty Theater, which was behind you, okay, it had this secondary entrance to one of the little retail spaces in the east wing that was probably operated as a candy store. And so you could actually stand in the lobby of the theater, and across the counter, you could purchase things from the little store that was really next door. Kind of like a concession stand, right? So, very interesting discovery. Next. And I think that part of his inspiration here was he was probably very well aware of the phenomenon in Bronzeville, in Chicago, of the Regal Theater and the nearby Savoy Ballroom that together occupied just about a whole block, and together was just an incredibly successful African-American entertainment venue that was, had movies and theatrical productions and opportunities for dancing, all sorts of things, that was making a whole lot of money for the owners. And I think this was part of his inspiration. This was like world famous Regal Theater and Savoy Ballroom. Next. Okay, now we'll just talk about the Liberty Theater, the western part of the Liberty complex. Okay? And this was a theater primarily equipped for motion picture projection, motion picture exhibition, but it also accommodated stage shows on the western side of the building near the southwestern corner. You can still see, it's blocked up, you can still see where the stage entrance was from an alleyway. And that stage entrance led onto a small stage that was probably about 10 or 12 feet in depth, but sufficient to permit live entertainment, small orchestras, vocal performers, that kind of live entertainment could appear and did appear on the stage here at the Liberty Theater underneath the motion picture screen. Okay? And here was the announcement of the grand opening of the Liberty Theater on 22 June 1940. And the program included a Western and also a live musical performance by the Floyd Ray Orchestra. And presumably, because it was also announced that there would be a dance after the grand opening of the theater proper, and I suppose that the dance was actually next door in the Liberty Club, which we'll come to in a minute. And I suspect that Floyd Ray also played for the dance, but just a guess. Next. Okay. It became very clear, very fast, that the policy of making the Liberty a so-called colored-only theater was not working. And so by August, Martin changed the policy to make it match the admissions policy of the Palace Theater, which had proven successful. And so he announced that there would be white patrons admitted to the ground floor, where we are now seated, and African American patrons would be relegated to the balcony, which no longer exists. Okay? And he also seems to have changed the programming, maybe, because I don't know too much about the early programming, but it seems possible that he also began to book more movies that might have been more appealing to white audiences than African American audiences. It's kind of another guess. Next. Okay. He seems to have run into problems with the new policy as well. And by October of 1940, he seems to have at least chosen programming that was maybe more appealing to the African American audiences. He was clearly trying different things, trying to make a success of this theater, and apparently not getting very far. Next. Clearly, however, there was an audience in Valdosta for what in the late 30s and 1940s were called race pictures. These were motion pictures that were 100% or very close to 100% African American produced. They tended to be directed by African American directors like Oscar Michaud. They often starred 100% African American casts. And so they were very, very appealing, especially to African American audiences. And there was enough demand for this sort of thing that some people actually organized a double feature of so-called race pictures in the Dasher High School auditorium. It included a personal appearance by Carmen Newsom, who was starring in this one of the movies that was shown. Next. Okay, but by 1944, the Liberty Theater had shut down. It was not making money, and Martin simply shut it down, and he donated the space for the use of the war effort. And the theater became the Valdosta Center for collecting scrap paper for the war effort. Next. Okay, after the war, it would appear that the Liberty Theater reverted to its original status as a theater for colored only, quote unquote, with a programming policy that again emphasized race pictures. Next. At the time, as the 40s wore on, there's evidence that there was a clearly discriminatory policy going on in Martin's theaters in Valdosta. His theaters that catered exclusively or primarily to white patrons seemed to be the ones where he showed the more recent movies, the more desirable movies, where the theaters that catered exclusively or primarily to African American patrons, these ended up with movies that had been released several years earlier and were basically second or third runs. Next, okay? And so the Liberty Theater struggled along for a while, and in 1958, it had been empty for a while, and the building was sold to Ferguson Tile Company, which is a local concern. It was a wholesaler and retailer of ceramic tile. And really, it's to the credit of Mr. Ferguson that the building continues to exist, because he figured out an economic use of the space that allowed it to continue to exist and not be demolished. And he used the floor of the theater. I'm guessing that the floor originally sloped, and so he had to put in a new concrete floor that was flat. And underneath where we're seeing, this is just a little piece that survives. He exhibited different kind of tile patterns that he would sell you. So when you came into this space, you could actually see examples of what your tile might look like once it was installed in your home or business. Okay, so now we'll turn our attention to the Liberty Theater building, which is what Mr. Martin called the East Wing. Okay, this was the part of the building that had non-theatrical use and a variety of non-theatrical uses. On the ground floor, it had a number of retail shops that were for lease. I've already alluded to the one that was probably a candy store. And then facing, most of these shop fronts faced onto South Ashley Street, and they had several notable tenants, including Hunter's Tavern and the very famous Liberty package store that was actually operated by Kelly Kalil, who was part of Valdosta's, a prominent member actually of Valdosta's Lebanese Palestinian community. Okay, another, probably the most famous of all the downstairs tenants was Pompey's Billiards, okay, which occupied the space at 404. Okay, next. 404 and a half, which was the entire upper floor of the East Wing, approximately 3,000 square feet, was leased very rapidly as to someone who wanted to run a nightclub there, and it was dubbed the Liberty Club. And you can see how it was listed in the phone book for many years in Valdosta, and it was advertised in various venues and well known as a nightclub that catered only to so-called colored patrons. Next, okay. This was in business until 1994 with very little interruption, although over the years the name of the club, or the nightclub upstairs, did change several times. Next. And here's just sort of some of the events that can be documented through the Valdosta Times, through articles or ads in Valdosta Times. And one of the last really big events, I think, that took place during the glory years of the Liberty Club, which was the 1950s, was this dance that was held as a celebration by the Valdosta's semi-pro baseball team. It was the Trojans, which was one of the Negro Leagues teams that was based here in Valdosta. I don't know if everybody remembers how we had one of those teams, but there you have it. They had their big dance here, October 1957. Okay. There was a lot of live entertainment at the Liberty Club, and it was really top caliber entertainers who were booked into the Liberty Club. There was, of course, Floyd Ray, whom I've already mentioned. There you have his little picture of his orchestra performing. Next. Hartley Toots with his vocalist, who I think actually became more famous than he did. Melrose Colbert, there you go. Also in 1940, next. And this was, Father Hines made a habit of performing at different venues around Lowndes County, and he probably or possibly played at the Liberty Club on his tour in 1941. Next. And probably the best known of the people that performed at the Liberty Club was Ella Fitzgerald, who performed here also in 1941 with the Chick Webb Band. So that gives you a sampling of the kind of entertainment that was made available to Valdosta's African American community in the 1940s. And it's worth bearing in mind that during this time of Jim Crow, the ability to go to a place like the Liberty Club that was relatively elegant and safe and interesting, and you could have, as an African American couple or person, you could have a nice time in nice surroundings where you could maybe forget your troubles for a while and listen to genuinely first-class entertainment. And I think that this experience, it's not the Jim Crow origins of the Liberty Theater, I think, that are prized memories of Valdosta's African American community. I suspect it's more the memories of the Liberty Club. Next. And here's yet another one. This was, I guess I got this one a little backwards. 1942, this was Graham Jackson, famous keyboardist. Next. Okay. Now we'll move into something I actually know about. I'm not expert on movies and music. I'm just faking it. Okay? I'm more interested in architecture. And the Liberty Theater and Liberty Theater building have been on my radar since I began studying Valdosta's architecture in a serious way about 25 years ago, because they are were absolutely outstanding examples of modern architecture here in Valdosta. Next. Okay. There is very little in the way of modern architecture that was built in Valdosta prior to the end of World War II, and none of it from that period matches the sophistication of the architecture of the Liberty complex. This was likely the earliest extant, maybe I should have struck you that one, the earliest extant example of commercial modern architecture in Valdosta, and quite interestingly, all of the really early, or almost all of the really early examples are on the south side, which was really the economic engine for Valdosta prior to the 1960s. It was here on the south side. This is where people were making money, okay? And it was, I don't know what to do with these sentences I have on my slides. It was really the greatest work of architecture in Valdosta that exemplified the international style. The best example. Next. Let's move on. Okay. What is the international style? The international style was one of a number of expressions of modern architecture. A lot of people tend to think that modern architecture is one kind of style, but in fact, it was a collection of many different sub-styles, one of which was called the international style. What are the characteristics of the international style of modernism? Well, you can see them all exemplified here in that east wing, the so-called Liberty Theater building. The design is rooted in functionalism. The most important thing was that the building should function efficiently, okay? The mass expressed itself as a volume. It looked like a rather solid thing, okay? There was an avoidance of axial symmetry. There was no definite center to the facade composition. There was reticence in ornamentation. In fact, almost no ornamentation at all on this building, and instead an articulation of structure. So you could see exactly what the structure was. It was brick bearing wall. The windows were steel casement windows. You could see that at a glance, and there was an honest use of material. The brick was left in its natural color. You could see that it was brick. The same with the plate glass and the metal window frames. You knew they were metal. Okay? Next. Okay, and the architecture here was up to date and very much the equal of some of the best works of modern architecture that were built in Columbus in the late 30s and early 40s. Columbus was an especially progressive town in Georgia on the architectural scene. And of course, Martin was from Columbus, so this, I think, explains his taste and his choice of style for this building. Next. Okay. Another sub-style of modernism is known as Art Deco. This originated about 1925 and was still somewhat popular as late as the early 1950s. Art Deco modernism is somewhat, some might say, compromised. Its functionalism is balanced by formalism. The mass expressed itself as a mass, not so much as a volume. You don't have too much of a sense, because the windows are relatively small, of what is inside. There's a tolerance of axial symmetry, at least in the two upper floors. The lowermost floor, the ground floor, was asymmetrical. There was definitely a pursuit of novelty in ornamentation. It accepted ornamentation, and it preferred that the ornamentation be unusual and fresh looking. Okay? The structure was subsumed by appearance. There was not necessarily a mania for expressing the structure. You might just want to plaster over the structure and paint it, for example. And there was a very pragmatic use of materials, because they might end up being painted anyway, and you just use whatever materials seem to be most economical or most suitable for any given purpose. Art Deco. And again, this was an example quite as good as some of the examples of Art Deco in Columbus. This is another Columbus building you see here from, I think, 1938. Still exists. Next. Probably the Art Deco building in the Columbus area that had the biggest impact on Martin and his taste in theater design was the main theater that was built in 1938 at Fort Benning near Columbus by one or possibly a partnership of Columbus architects. And I think you can see from the facade exactly where Martin got his idea for his future architectural branding of his theaters. Next. Because here you can see just how much the Valdosta and the Liberty relied on the example of the main theater at Fort Benning. And I've made this little sketch to show you what no longer exists, my guess of how the ground level, the lobby entrance area looked originally. I think it looked very, very similar to the Valdosta. It had on your left an area of blank wall that would be suitable for movie posters. Then it had some doors, 2 pairs of double doors. It then had a box office, and finally a door to the balcony that was probably also functioned as an employee's entrance for the projectionist especially. Next. These facades of the Valdosta and the Liberty were pretty much certainly designed by a guy called Rufus Bland. He was really an interior decorator. He later called himself an architect. He was active in Columbus and for many years was actually an employee of the Martin Theater's company, although it seems very, very likely that he was doing work for Martin Theaters before he actually became a full-time employee, which happened in 1940, okay? So just about the time of construction here. Martin in the mid-30s, and it does coincide with when Bland became active as a professional in Columbus. Martin began building across the South some very definitely modern theater facades using modern architecture to attract attention to his theaters and therefore customers. Next. And here you see a couple of other examples in Georgia and Alabama that were pretty much certainly designed by Rufus Bland for the Martin interests. Very much like the Valdosta and the Liberty in conception and execution. Next. And also for some of non-theatrical buildings that were built by Martin interests. This was an amusement park in Phoenix City, Alabama, kind of I think it was like a for-profit venture, kind of public park that was established in 1941. And here's like the entrance to the stadium. You can see its facade was designed very much along the same lines that were being used for Martin Theaters at the time. Next. A problem in historic preservation. Okay, I guess we reached the less pleasant aspects of this talk. Well, as of the late 90s, the East Wing existed only as a shell because it had been severely damaged by a fire. And meantime, the main block, the western part of the building, stood vacant, and there was no very obvious economic use for the space where we're now seated. Should we take a little bit of a break while the train goes by? I'm not sure I can compete. But anyway, and although both of these structures were historically valuable to Valdosta, and even the United States, as we'll see, as well as to the state of Georgia, as we'll see, their association with the Jim Crow era compromised their appeal to a lot of people who might otherwise have been interested in the preservation of such structures. This was a problem that was not unique to Valdosta. This was a problem being preoccupied historic preservationists across the country of what do you do with buildings that have unpleasant associations. For example, that housing that had been created for enslaved persons before the war, or prisons, or Jim Crow theaters. It was hard to make a case for how these could be interpreted properly for educational purposes, and it was hard to get people to spend a lot of money on these buildings that many people would have just preferred should disappear. Okay? Next. Nevertheless, in 1990, both of these buildings, they were perceived as separate buildings. I guess that was one measure of the success of the architecture. But they were perceived to be separate buildings, and they were noticed in a survey of historic resources existing in Georgia at that time. And here you see the listing as it was later transformed into a searchable database, which you can consult yourself if you dare on the internet. I don't think it's particularly user-friendly, but it's designed to be used not only by members of the public, but especially by public officials in localities and counties across Georgia, so that they can inform themselves about the historical value of structures in their jurisdictions when it comes to making decisions that might affect them. Next. And there were some people in Valdosta who, regardless or possibly because of the interests that buildings of the Jim Crow era have, they are important documents of an important era, even if it was an unpleasant era in United States history. They became very interested in the preservation of these buildings in particular, and of the South Side neighborhood in general. And this small group of people included, notably, Amanda Brown, who became the individual primarily, I'm almost tempted to say, single-handedly instrumental in seeing to the preservation of the Liberty complex between 1998 and 2024. Okay, and well, if we go back, you can see that this group managed to get the South Side Historic District established on the National Register, which meant that the Secretary of the Interior, the government of the United States, recognized the value of this entire neighborhood, including the Liberty Theater, which was one of the so-called contributing buildings that was singled out as one of the reasons justifying the establishment of the Southside Historic District. Okay, this happened in 2007. And another very, very interesting note that appears in the nomination for the Southside Historic District, which amounts to a federal finding of fact, is that the construction of the James Beck overpass in 1980 to 81 divided the neighborhood and brought about the destruction of many buildings in its path, eliminated many businesses, etc., and ultimately resulted in a very extensive economic degradation of numerous blocks on either side of the overpass, which remains to this day extremely difficult to redevelop for any kind of profit-making activity. So there you have a federal finding of fact. We don't see this every day, do we? Perhaps not. Next. And here you see the Beck overpass, and here you see how it affected the Liberty Theater in particular. It essentially isolated the Liberty complex in a sea of nothingness, okay? Whereas it had originally been built and intended to be part of a streetscape that not only went across Florida Avenue, was the complement of another streetscape on the north side of Florida Avenue, and which turned the corner and became part of a streetscape on South Ashley Street that again had another complement across on the east side of that same block. Okay? And it was part of an entire neighborhood, but from 1981, it was just kind of isolated and to a certain extent took on a false presence within a space that had therefore never existed. Next. Okay. Nevertheless, the state of Georgia kept an eye on this building, and in 2016, the state conducted a comprehensive survey of all the theaters that were still standing across Georgia. And you can see that the Liberty Theater which was still thought of as a separate building, it got listed here in 2016 in this survey of historic resources. Okay? Next. So, we will talk about the opportunity in historic preservation that was presented by this complex, but later lost. Next. So in 1998, the Quality of Life Association, which was founded and led by Amanda Brown, acquired both the parcel on the corner that had the shell of the Liberty Theater building standing on it, and this parcel, which had the Liberty Theater proper still standing on it, although it was in pretty rough shape by then as well. Next, and in 2021, Quola engaged Ellis Rickett Associates Architects, distinguished firm here in Valdosta, to remodel the theater part of the building into the situation in which you see it tonight. Next. Okay. And so what was the opportunity here? Well, the opportunity, by the 2000s, people had sort of resolved their issues with architecture of the Jim Crow era. People had figured out ways where buildings from the Jim Crow era could be presented in a fair manner to the general public that neither celebrated them nor portrayed them as 100% evil, that could embody good memories for certain parts of the population. Anyhow, what people realized they had here in Valdosta was a purpose-built and architecturally distinguished urban entertainment complex. I don't really know of another one in Georgia from this period, but I don't know every building in Georgia. And if somebody can point out another one to me, I would be sincerely grateful. Okay? It was significant in Georgia's business history because of its association with the Martin Theaters chains, which was one of America's leading theatrical exhibition businesses. Okay? And it was important to American social history because of its involvement with the movies, which have always been very influential in 20th century United States. Okay? And it belonged to African American cultural history during the Jim Crow period because of its association with all of these first-class, top-rated African American entertainers who were performing for Valdosta audiences, especially during the 1940s, but even later. And second of all, it was one of the two cultural and physical anchors of the Southern Division of Valdosta's downtown, which in the 40s, 50s, and into the 60s was kind of perceived by the locals as Valdosta's black downtown. Rightly or wrongly. Next. Okay? And above and beyond that, it was a functionally and architecturally matched pair of modern buildings that not only exemplified the architecture of spatial segregation that was significant in documenting how Jim Crow worked during the mid-20th century in Georgia, and therefore had a strong potential to become a draw for heritage tourism, but they were also just great pieces of modern architecture that related to each other. Next. And finally, they were great examples of adaptive reuse. Quola had offered the city of Valdosta a wonderful example of how you could actually find a use for a building that was historically important, but was situated in an economically very unpromising part of town because of the overpass, and yet it could function in ways that were beneficial to the Valdosta community. And among the different ways that it has proven itself beneficial over the years, most recently has been its hosting of the Lowndes County Soup Kitchen. Go, next. Okay. I'm not sure, or can I see the next slide? I'm not sure if I have this on the right thing. Yeah, I think I got these a little bit backwards. So, well into the 21st century, there was quite a lot of optimism, both among people associated with COLA and among people affiliated with people interested in the history of Valdosta. There was quite a bit of optimism that it would still be possible to do something to quote unquote save the shell of the Liberty Theater building, the building on the corner of Florida and South Ashland. And here was like one of the visions from the ERA Architects Circuit, from Circuit 2000 when they were working for COLA. That was kind of their vision of how it could actually be restored and usable as a building again. Next, should we go next? Okay, and that's just what it looked like at that time. There's a lot of optimism. And now can we go back those two slides? I'll show you what it is. And one more back. Sorry about this, folks. So part of this optimism was inspired by this particular entry in the Valdosta's downtown master plan. I think this is from 2010, okay, in which you can see a listing there, made kind of a little red arrow there at the bottom, okay, in which the city went on record as intending to work with COLA to continue rehabilitation of the historic Liberty Theater block, which of course meant this part of the block as well as the east wing next door. So now we can skip ahead. Sorry for getting these out of order. And there was even some interest in the possibilities offered by the shell for being stabilized and used as an outdoor gathering space, as had happened in a number of situations, including notably this one in Alabama, which had been a theater that burned out, and it became a public gathering space that just preserved what the fire left intact of the theater. There was a similar situation in Mississippi, and I'm blanking on the name of the town, where they had another theater that only existed now as a shell. It became an outdoor blues music venue that helps to attract tourists to this area. So there were people who really were pretty optimistic about the uses to which that shell could be put if stabilized, both as a potentially an interior space, but also as a potential outdoor space. Next. Okay. And, I was going to tell you. Well, no, you got to go back. There we go.
Okay, sorry.
Okay. And then everybody was kind of holding their breath there at the end of August, because apparently there were some pessimists here in Valdosta that thought the hurricane was going to get it. But it did not. And I came and took this picture actually the afternoon as soon as the rain stopped. I came down here to check it out. And that's a picture from the afternoon of August 30th, 2023, when I was pleased to see that the hurricane had not gotten.
That was the billboard.
Huh?
The billboard did not survive.
Yes. I'm glad you noticed that. You know, I had not picked up on that. Next. Okay. But, you know, what hurricanes don't get, people do. And so now we come to 24th of January, 2024, when the building did disappear. Next. This is the announcement that appeared on that same day, on that same morning, issued by the city of Valdosta, justifying the demolition and calling attention to the city's next concern for the safety and well-being of the community. Next. 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 And next. And a gun. Perhaps another. And among the casualties of this demolition was actually a work of art that was not part of the building. It was just a furnishing of the exterior of the building, a gift to the street, so to speak. But this work was mutilated and destroyed by the demolition process. Next. Some concluding remarks. Next. History is not really concerned with simply documenting what happened. The real business of history is to try to figure out the significance of things that happened. And that's at least the way I think of my role as an historian, is to try to interpret what happened and try to figure out what was important about it. Okay? And one thing that I think is important about this demolition is it echoes, or it sort of confirms a statement that when I ran across it, it startled me. That appears, I think this is from about 2006 or 8. This was you can read it up there better than I can. The City of Valdosta's Neighborhood Revitalization Plan, okay? And in this document, you can see that the City of Valdosta saw itself not as an entity collaborating with the State Historic Preservation Office, which is charged with administering the National Register districts within Georgia, among other things, but actually saw itself as the city saw itself as an adversary of this agency of the state of Georgia. They saw they saw historic preservation, particularly of districts, as a barrier to the city's development. And with the demolition, I think we see a kind of evidence that this attitude persists. Next. And the thing has now been reduced to a kind of memory, a kind of image that's not only in our minds, but at least one case here on a wall downtown, a pictorial image that kind of betrays what I would call a tokenism with respect to African American culture, especially material culture, that survives here in Valdosta, and suggests that while it might be fine as something to depict on a mural, it's not something fine to preserve in its material reality. Next. And finally, what I think is one of the most troubling thoughts that the demolition has brought to my mind is the possible impact of the demolition on the integrity and even viability of the Southside Historic District, which, among other things, provides tax credits to dozens of property owners who may not even be completely aware of how the demolition of one building can affect the economic fortunes of a building that they happen to own in a very different part of the neighborhood. Um, but what you see here, and I can't remember if I have more in the next slide or if I should talk about it here. Can we go briefly forward? No, go to the next back. Okay. So the troubling thing about it is because of the isolation of the Liberty block, okay, within the Florida Avenue streetscape, okay, a big part of the justification for including this block or the components of this block as a contributor to the South Side District was the fact that the piece of it on the corner linked the theater to the streetscape of South Ashley Street that had a much larger percentage of its historical fabric surviving. And now that the link, the physical link and the visual link between the theater that still remains standing and what remains standing on South Ashley Street has been severed, has been destroyed, it seems to me that there's much less justification for continuing to include the theater as a contributing structure. And I think that anyone involved in historic preservation in Valdosta would be very naive to think that this question is not already being scrutinized in Atlanta and possibly in Washington. Next. And I thank you for listening.
Hi, my name is Vicki. Thank you, Al, for doing this again, and Erica for hosting. I don't know how many were here the last time, but it was a standing room only. So I think that was when we were a little bit optimistic, and we've had a fail. So we've just got to figure out how to, what we need to do next. Al has prepared a flyer, and I'm gonna give to everyone. We've got extras that you can give to your friends. And I think we need to do more and more of these talks so we can raise awareness of other buildings that are endangered. Dasher High School has a hole in the ceiling. There's a group actively working to save that building. Coastal Plains is a very good caretaker of that structure. But we've got other buildings around town that are endangered, and they're just, you don't really see them. You go over the overpass, you don't go under the overpass. So maybe when you're going back and forth, take a little bit more time and slow down and look around. So thank you for coming.
Yeah. All right, thank you. All right, so to celebrate, two things. Black history. I'm a chef. I love to cook. I actually closed my restaurant that I've had for 10 years, Caribbean Delight, last year. And now I'm the cook for Cola Soup Kitchen. So tonight I cook you guys something so that you can get a taste of what they eat at the soup kitchen. And to celebrate, my history, African American history, Black history. So I cook some soul food, and what I made is soul food in a bowl. We got some collard greens, that's what you smell, some homemade buttermilk cornbread, and what else I put? Some smothered chicken and rice. A lot of people think I am Jamaican. I'm 100%. I'm 100% from South Georgia, Lakeland, Georgia. So I love to cook, but I know how to cook soul food too. Thank you guys for coming out. We really appreciate it, and I pray that, you know, we just learn from you know, what just happened, and we can just move forward and try to preserve as much. I'm so thankful for Al, Jess Gaines. She's another jewel in this community, and Vicki Everett for just, you know, making awareness of historical preservation and just the educational of it. And let's keep this going, and let's learn about all history. And let's try to continue to try to preserve and save and reuse what we already have. I mean, I know some situations you have to do what you got to do, but if we can, like even this space, you know, now we feed between 150 to 200 people that this may be, I think a lot of them, this is their only meal. So I'm thankful for that. And do anyone have any questions? I think between Al.
Why don't I just hang around while y'all have supper?
Yeah, so we'll take a couple questions and then the boo is in the back and you can just grab and go.
Okay, I don't have any questions. I just want to.
I'll be happy to take some questions. You
We're
want
gonna take a few.
or comment?
What's your name again? She said Al, but the whole name?
Al Willis.
Al Willis.
Okay, I guess I'll go back up.
Yeah,
Okay, if it's question time.
this is a talk, so you talk and then.
Okay.
Okay, I just want to let people know that I'm with the Get to Free Press social media guy, and this video will be on YouTube and Facebook and Twitter and most everywhere else on Valdosta G.B.R. channel.
Okay.
Valdosta G.B.R. on YouTube. But mainly what I want to say was I want to thank everybody that came out. I go across the state of Georgia, and I just want to appreciate the people who are alive and willing to participate, you know, to such events like this. And even the people that are here, there are always people working behind the scenes that we may never know. And so I want to thank, and you may not like this, but I gotta say it. I said it at the university when the professor spoke with Kinderloo. I don't know if you all heard of the history of Kinderloo. If you haven't, please go to Boston G.B.R. and see what they call Kinderloo. Kinderloo was the leasing chain gang farm. That's what it was done, and you got to see how they treated those black people out there on Kinderloo. And this professor at DSU, he did an outstanding job. I was the only somebody that I know of that recorded, and I thank God that I recorded for having one of the best recordings I ever done, and people are watching it. Please see the history of Kinderloo. I did not know that it had a history like that. I really did. Thank you.
Thank you.
Any more questions or
Was that another
comments?
question?
I just got one. Okay, I heard what Ms. Vicki was saying, that it's a lot of the buildings, you know, like Dasher High. What about this building now? Are they planning on wanting to demolish more buildings, or what are we gonna do about that? For this plan that they got in place?
I don't know, but I will say it is.
You have to watch for the signs. The signs from my experience is stickers
Yeah.
that they put on the buildings.
Earlier this evening, I noticed that the Dennis Food Store, which is a South Side kind of landmark, that's more associated with the Lebanese American community of Valdosta, perhaps, than the African American community. But nevertheless, it's a really important landmark on the South Side. Remodeling of that seems to have begun today.
Is that the one down?
Right down here, later became Blanton's. Of course, in recent years, we've lost Mitchell's Barbecue building, which was, you know, not the fault of the city, I don't believe.
Well, the city gave him a sign and he just decided to.
Anyway, this kind of hurt me because it's one of my best childhood memories is being taken down. You young people, I guess, don't know about it, but it was a really wonderful, wonderful treat to go to Mitchell's Barbecue if you were a kid, or even if you weren't a kid, right? Is that right?
Absolutely.
And so there just seems to be an awful lot of demolition going on in Valdosta lately. I want to draw attention to what I think is a demolition that caused even greater harm to Valdosta's modernist heritage and which was the demolition, I believe, last summer of the Valdosta High School on the north side, because this was, in my opinion, the preeminent example of a post-segregationist high school in South Georgia. This was the best example of such a building type that was in South Georgia. It was also an architectural masterpiece of the local architect Zeb Lackey, who was a nationally recognized architect. I think maybe the only one who really was nationally recognized for his contributions. And this really was the building, more than any other building in South Georgia, not just Valdosta, that represented the success of the civil rights project, the civil rights movement. In a sense, the building that bookended, historically speaking, buildings like this one that represented what the civil rights movement was struggling against. I see people nodding. I hope this is making sense to you. I don't think I'm the best when I'm talking off the top of my head, but it is what it is. But I thank you for your question.
From our experience of it, I think you have to pay attention to the signs, because they will like put a violation and it just go forth. But that's where you're gonna need like the community, because it takes money, to be honest.
Yeah,
And the
every
support.
historic preservation project
Take money.
has to be economically
Yeah,
viable.
Yes.
That's money
it takes
buys.
money, because a lot of, I mean, I agree with, even ours, we had a safety issue, but it was just hard receiving funding without giving up our building. So, I mean, it is what it is, so.
But if you look at across the tracks, those a lot of buildings over there, but they're not being torn down though, they're receiving funding. And that's the difference, over on that side of town, where the buildings are being restored, finished, but then over here, everything, it seems like you get a notice, or you tear down, no funding to help.
But that's why I love these type of events, and I want to do more in the African American community. You'll be surprised. A lot of African Americans, they just, I mean, honestly, don't care. But what I see about, other landmarks, they will pull money together.
$9 million in the
And ours-
courthouse.
Hold on, I mean, they own a courthouse. Well, hold on, somebody just courthouse.
Let's not go to the court.
We're gonna change the
No,
subject,
I'm just
but
saying.
I can see it on
Let's be
both
real.
ends,
Let's be
because
real.
we
Money.
didn't have we had a lack of support on both ends. We didn't have anybody who would say, here go $200, $300, $500,000 because we wanna save this, because it was the hole in the wall, it was the Liberty Club, and the city wasn't gonna do it because they didn't
That's
own
where
it.
Splot's
Even though they
coming
put it
in.
in their plan, they didn't own it. So we were stuck between,
That's where Splot's come in. They don't have.
that's where you got to vote the
There you
people who
go.
understand.
There you go.
So it still take people, it
Right.
still take both parties. If you're gonna vote,
And
or
that's
I
what
can't
the
vote, I
city
live in the
coming.
county. So vote for people who understand about preserving, because before they demolished it, they had their little meeting and they voted against it.
Right.
So it plays both ends. You got to have the community support, not just talk, but with money. And the city, and that support is the city council. You gotta have people on there that understand. And every now and then pop up on them and say, we want to see you preserving all history in Valdosta. And the more they hear that, I feel like when projects come, when it's time to vote, they will do that. But if it's a safety issue, and they're not owning that building like the courthouse, they're not gonna spend that money unless they own that building.
Right.
So if you don't
Even if
have,
it's the sidewalk in front of the courthouse, they're not so interested in that either.
so,
You can go see.
hopefully this will, I'm trying to look at the brighter picture of it.
That's the city. The courthouse is
Well,
the
that's what I
county,
mean.
the sidewalk
That's
is the
what-
city.
The city is different from the county to me. I live in the county, so vote people who understand and continue to promote historical preservation. And if it's a problem in the African American community, that's where you got to continue to educate those that live in the African American. I'm from Lakeville.
Right.
We're small, but we're different. Here, it is, I do see the division of it. I do see the haves and have-not. But do you care about your community enough to invest? Do you care about your community enough to vote people in that's gonna understand about voting, not voting against saving and reusing, you know what I'm saying, historical sites? So our experience, it was a war. We fought since 2018. And trust me, we put up a fight. Even reaching out to organizations like, Valdosta Heritage Foundation. But I mean, I'm not gonna say we lost the fight, because we still have one side, and we're showing that you can reuse it with the little bit of money we have. But it takes money, and it takes the support of the community when they're educated and when they have a passion about preserving. Is it right? Do I agree what happened? No, but I mean, it is what it is. It takes money, it takes support, and it takes voting the right people in the community. Come on, don't leave me.
The work that was done in this building, as far as, the funding of it, what was the cost to be able to get this building revitalized and, considered,
Back in
safe?
2001.
So I think
It was grant funded, I know that much.
it was barns. No, it was people like barns. If you look on our door.
The purchase of the property was grant funded according to the Valdosta Times.
No,
And
that's not correct.
Well-
No, it did not cost much.
according to the Valdosta Times, they had a grant that purchased the building in
Okay.
2001. And then I think there were local businesses that contributed.
You may be right. Okay, so, but Valdosta is considered
I'm just
metropolitan
crediting
now.
the Valdosta
At
Times. I could
that
be on
time,
shifting
there were
sand. couldn't I?
grants available because Dr. Brown was getting USDA funding. But when Valdosta pushed and they transferred to metropolitan, Dr. Brown lost a lot of grant funding. Because it's different whenever you're metro and rural. You can go directly to the government, USDA, and get a grant. A lot of grants now, you got to go pass through like a government entity to get grants. Did she purchase this building with a grant? Dr. Brown?
She pushed that over there.
Oh, on that side,
Yeah, this part here.
was given to her,
Some child
gifted to her.
gifted her. and
I'm just quoting what it
state
said
is
in the
not
paper.
profit.
I don't know.
Yeah, I thought this side was gifted to her,
She
like a
not,
gift.
this part gifted, this theater.
I'm not sure the Valdosta Times is always reliable.
And she bought that spot over there.
I'm just saying, what was.
But to answer your question, Home Depot, they invested in it. Mr. Turner and I, we invested personal money in it. Barnes, they invested. And I think she used maybe some other grants or whenever she was doing the
It was small
USDA.
grants she was
But it
getting
was like
back.
small little grants.
Davis over there, I think something.
But there are grants.
But what
get
kind
them
of
now.
cost did just revitalizing this section incur?
Well, it was in 2001, so whatever the cost was, it would be more.
What did
than-
Barnes give you all?
But-
Like 30-something thousand?
I don't know.
27.
27,000.
We took this, that's what we used this right here for and paint the ramp. If you saw this here before, we did this, you would believe.
And the big thing was the roof. It had to
Because
have-
the ceilings there
That
was.
was the
theater,
biggest
ceilings all
single
over
thing
there.
in the.
And I'll be done with my last question.
Okay.
Is, just from an architectural, historical sort of, thought, is are buildings that do have 4 walls supporting a roof typically better able to survive, especially being condemned, as opposed to a building similar to the Liberty Theater building that was sort of married onto this building and only had the 3 walls?
And
Well,
then-
well, that part was a brick bearing wall structure also. I'm just saying, this was a party wall. So this was used to support the bearing walls, 2 of the bearing walls of the structure next door. They were part of the same thing. It's just the way it was engineered. But there's no one particular kind of structure that's more likely to survive than another. It has to do with how well built something was. And I think, I am not a structural engineer, but I think the fact that that east wing survived the hurricane.
Amen.
When a block away, a building not much older was really demolished, is the word I would use, by the hurricane. And across the street, there was another building that was damaged by the hurricane. And this particular one was not. It wasn't just the fact that it was a brick bearing wall structure, it was the fact that it was a structure that was built to very high quality standards. And, you know, now we have something called value engineering, which is the opposite of quality
It
standards.
need that roof though.
And over time, you know, different cities have become populated by buildings that are built to lower and lower standards of quality. So when hurricanes come, or the roof disappears for whatever reason, or a fire guts it, they might be less salvageable than a building that had been built to higher quality standards. And you know, in the 19th century, buildings were expected to last 400 years. They were conceptualized as investments.
Eventually.
Okay. Blake Ellis, the architect who was involved in this in 2001, he told me that in the 1950s here in Valdosta, that when you had a roof put on your house, you routinely got a 100-year guarantee. Has anyone got a 100-year guarantee on their roof lately?
Was that the roof or the shingles?
The roof, the whole roof.
The shingles aren't made to last 100 years.
Well, these were built-up roofs you were talking about.
Yeah.
Okay?
Like the wood slat roofs?
No, they were asphalt roofs. But the fact is that, you know, there are buildings here that are in pretty rough shape. I don't want to name any names. But there are buildings around town that are in pretty rough shape. And I am confident that if nothing is done to them, they're going to still be there in 100 years from now. Because when they were built, they were being built to last 200 years or more. And a lot of this has to do with social expectation of time. Like houses, they thought, oh, well, this house is going to pass down to generations who are going to live in this house. So they wanted it to last 200 years. You know,
There is no Georgia state flag displayed over the Lowndes County Courthouse and over many other government buildings to honor members of our armed forces, as in other cities, counties, and states across the United States of America. Moreover, we give home to Moody Air Force Base combat battlefield personnel that places their individual life on the line. However, for years our elected officials have failed to display a Georgia state flag. How sad and disrespectful to those that serves. Romans 13 verses 7 to 10. KJV, G.B.R.